Welcome to the debate. Today we're diving into a really monumental policy shift in Hainan, specifically the implementation of the official separate customs operation, often referred to as Fengguan. And let's be clear from the outset, this is not a security shutdown, it's a profound, high-level institutional and economic restructuring. The whole thing is designed to solidify the island's status as a world-class free trade port.
And it is absolutely critical that we frame this correctly. We're analyzing a complex customs boundary adjustment, one that's been implemented to maximize economic liberation within that zone.
Precisely. This shift introduces a whole new administrative and economic reality for everyone involved. So the central question for us today is this. Does establishing Hainan as a separate customs supervision zone primarily promise a high-level systemic transformation and sustainable economic liberation, or does the immediate and, I think, necessary complexity of it all create unavoidable burdens, regulatory friction, and local dislocation? I'm going to argue that this is a critical institutional upgrade that guarantees long-term prosperity.
And I will argue that we have to examine the friction created on the ground. There's a huge gap between the elegance of a policy draft and the messiness of real-world implementation. And that gap introduces acute costs, both regulatory and social, that simply can't be overlooked.
I acknowledge the challenges, of course, but let's start with the immense systemic opportunity this policy unleashes. This change fundamentally transforms Hainan into what is, in effect, an offshore tariff zone that's still operating within the national framework. This is the mechanism that finally delivers on those long-promised economic pillars. Zero tariffs on imported raw materials and equipment, low tax rates for corporations and, high-end talent, and a simplified tax system.
The functional change is undeniable. I'll give you that. It shifts the island from being, let's say, just a domestic tourist spot to a global trading hub by adjusting its whole economic positioning.
Exactly. And this deep level of opening, this new institutional architecture, is really the only way to fundamentally upgrade the island's economic structure beyond just sun and sand tourism. We're talking about attracting and sustaining modern service industries that rely on free trade and capital flow. Things like specialized shipping and logistics, cross-border financial services, high-end manufacturing, and specialized medical and education projects. This structural shift, moving toward higher-value professional industries, is the overriding long-term benefit that justifies any temporary inconvenience.
This view relies so heavily on the success of a future structural change, and it seems to ignore the very real costs being borne today. While the intent is economic liberation, for the ordinary resident, the policy announcement, it often just acts as a catalyst for speculation long before the actual benefits of high-value employment ever materialize.
Are you speaking about market reactions here?
I am. We immediately see acute, speculative volatility in real estate, in hotels, in the commercial investment sectors. And this quickly inflates the cost of living, housing prices, rent, local commercial costs. The city might look objectively more prosperous to an outsider. You see new towers, new luxury hotels. But the personal financial situation for many locals becomes less and less tenable. This creates a really painful psychological gap, a kind of disparity between the perceived national objective and their own shrinking daily comfort.
That tension between high-speed growth and local affordability is certainly a factor we need to discuss, but let me redirect our focus back to the positive evolution of employment.
Please do.
This policy drives specialized employment growth. We are moving toward requiring skills in complex areas like foreign trade law, international finance, specific medical tech, and e-commerce logistics. This isn't incidental. It's a necessary, proactive step away from an economy that's just dominated by low-wage hospitality. It's a move toward professional service industries that offer higher wages and greater economic stability. What's more, the policy encourages external talent, including more foreign citizens, to work and live there, raising the overall international character and, frankly, the competitive benchmark for the local workforce.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it very differently. While the long-term goal is skill diversification, The immediate effect of this growth is it's a much more real and almost brutal competition for the current young local population. They may not have the specialized degrees or the language proficiency required by these new multinational firms.
But that encourages necessary training and adaptation, doesn't it?
It forces adaptation at a breakneck speed, often while people are being financially squeezed. The immediate capital inflow causes housing speculation, whether it's in purchase prices or rental costs, to spike dramatically. This economic pressure forces local families to bear the initial, very high cost of the policy implementation. We're seeing established working-class communities displaced not by physical demolition, but simply by unaffordability.
While the administrative response to housing speculation must be swift and effective, that doesn't negate the overall economic modernization.
But the distortion goes beyond housing. The entire living environment becomes overly commercialized, or it's developed in a kind of scenic area-like manner. The natural rhythm of life is just disrupted. What used to be a distinct off-season for recovery and lower prices gets shorter and shorter, and the peak season for tourism and commercial activity becomes relentless. You can't overlook that this high-speed, high-level transformation fundamentally degrades the quality of life for the long-term resident. Their home becomes first and foremost a business commodity.
I will concede that the challenge of balancing growth with resident quality of life is the primary administrative test here. But let's shift our focus to the immediate regulatory friction affecting the visitor, which is, of course, essential to the policy's success. The declared goal for tourists is a freer experience, simpler procedures.
I see why you emphasize that stated goal, but we have to consider the non-negotiable regulatory countermeasure that the policy's design requires. The entire system is predicated on strictly preventing arbitrage and illicit profiteering, or what they call TOLI. And this means that the regulation on purchasing quotas, on frequency limits, and on declaring items when moving back to the mainland must not only remain in place, but must become more precise, more detailed to protect that new customs border.
So you're arguing that the new system paradoxically imposes more homework on the average tourist who just wants to shop?
Exactly. The duty-free status creates this massive inherent price differential. If a tourist is buying high-value goods, they still need to understand exactly what counts as personal use and how much needs to be declared without getting a penalty on the return to the mainland. This necessity of anti-arbitrage measures adds a layer of calculation, of caution, and documentation to the shopping experience, and that directly clashes with the stated ideal of seamless simplicity. I mean, if you simplify the rules too much, you invite massive smuggling. If you regulate it too rigorously, you ruin the freer experience. It's a fundamental trade-off.
That's a compelling argument regarding the current practical friction, but I think it overlooks the intended long-term technological trajectory. The policy goal is aggressive automation, electronification, and streamlining. The whole system is aiming for one code clearance. And while yes, rigorous supervision exists against illicit activities, for the ordinary traveler who stays within the generous limits, the ultimate goal is an experience that's significantly less complex than the typical overseas shopping and customs process.
Intentions are aspirational, but the regulatory body has to focus on deterrence today.
But the benefit of that deterrence is what allows for the expansion of supply. The island's value proposition isn't just simple shopping savings anymore. This transformation allows for massive increases in selection, expanded product categories, and much more competitive pricing than mainland retail. And more importantly, this shift in customs status encourages a conceptual pivot, moving Hainan from being a brief, check-in island visit to becoming a living scenario suitable for periodic, long stays. This depth of engagement for leisure, business, or specialized residents is a far greater long-term economic and social benefit than merely avoiding customs forms on a bag of cosmetics.
That brings us directly to the third point of contention, this shift in status from a simple tourist destination to a purported global hub.
Indeed. The institutional backing that the customs operation provide enables an increased focus on hosting international exhibitions, major conferences, professional sports events, and cultural festivals. This fundamentally changes the island's role. It evolves into a destination suitable for year-round business, for long-term winter residences, specialized training, creative residencies, you name it. This diversification stabilizes the economy, making it less reliant on seasonal beach tourism, which, at the end of the day, benefits everyone, including local professionals and business owners, who gain access to a larger, more sophisticated market.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning, because that kind of rapid internationalization, which is driven by external capital, often risks overlooking the welfare and quality of life for long-term residents. When a city shifts so dramatically to prioritize its role as a global hub or a visitor city, it inevitably faces the challenge of finding the equilibrium with the city where one actually lives.
But the capital required for high-quality infrastructure, better airports, better hospitals, better specialized schools, it comes from attracting this exact kind of external attention.
The problem is one of prioritization. Are those new specialized schools for the children of local fishermen, or are they for the children of the international executives the city is trying to court? If the increased development means that core municipal services like public transit, local schooling, affordable healthcare are constantly under pressure or being displaced by luxury commercial developments, then the perceived benefit of internationalization is primarily external. The local resident is just there to serve the global ecosystem without actually benefiting internally from the convenience or affordability. It's an unsustainable social contract.
So you're arguing that the focus on attracting, say, MICE capital, meetings, incentives, conferences, and exhibitions, is detrimental to existing resident services?
It risks distortion, absolutely. When local officials prioritize policies that maximize the flow of high-end visitors and international capital, the implicit cost is borne by the resident. For example, if the city needs specialized logistical staff for some big international event, the competition for housing and transport instantly spikes. The transformation has to be inclusive of the resident experience, ensuring they are not just economic footnotes in some grand plan.
I think we agree that the administrative execution, specifically managing housing stability and prioritizing inclusive infrastructure, is paramount. But the institutional foundation for attracting sophisticated services via zero tariffs and simplified regulatory zones, well, it's a necessary prerequisite for any growth on this scale.
I wholeheartedly agree on the necessity of that institutional foundation. However, anyone listening must remain acutely aware of the practical regulatory details, the fine print on quotas, frequency, and declaration. Furthermore, we have to rigorously monitor the potential for increased pressure on the cost of living and the intensity of local professional competition that accompanies a policy shift designed to attract massive external capital and expertise. The policy is fundamentally disruptive, and that disruption carries a measurable short-term social cost that is borne disproportionately by the existing resident base.
I acknowledge the very real and probably inevitable friction and social strain that accompanies high-speed, high-level opening. It is a genuine administrative and social concern that requires careful mitigation. However, I'll reiterate that the core, durable benefit lies in the structural economic transformation, the creation of sophisticated, highly paid professional opportunities that turn Hainan into a globally competitive, long-term living scenario rather than just confining it to the role of a seasonal vacation spot defined solely by consumption. The long-term prosperity promised requires this complex, short-term administrative transition.
The tension, then, remains firmly centered on that necessary, delicate balance. The commercial freedom that the new custom status champions versus the rigorous, fine-grained supervision required to maintain the integrity of that new customs boundary and prevent wide-scale arbitrage.
In that ongoing tension between economic liberation and necessary regulation, between systemic, national gain, and specific local cost, that is the constant factor that citizens, visitors, and residents alike must continuously adjust to as this unprecedented policy transition fully unfolds.